everybody, to Wine and, the show where we pair wine with movies, TV, music, books, and comics, because we think everyone should consume some of all of the above on a daily basis. Well, barring health concerns. Wine, as much as we love it, it is an ethanol product, and that is not the best for everyone. But as you've noticed with some of our guests that have been on in previous episodes, they don't always pair it with a wine. They don't always pair it with an alcoholic beverage. Have fun with the beverage and entertainment pairing shtick. If it's soda that you love, if it's seltzer water, if it's kombucha, whatever it is you're into, tea, coffee, single varietal coffees. Oh my God. Single varietal. They don't really call it that, do they? Single origin coffees. If you're into coffees, do that. But then, and also on the subject of health concerns, for fuck's sake, get outdoors. Don't only watch movies, read books, read comics. If you're listening to music, run or take a long walk. Right? Don't. Doesn't have to be super extreme. Just get a little health in your life. If you drink in moderation. I think this is always a very important PSA to make at the beginning of these episodes. I'm not going to do it at the beginning of every episode, but sometimes. And today it's just me and Dallas. There is no guest, so we're just going to kind of wing it. We're just going to be kind of chit-chatting. Just the two of us.
One of us will actually be drinking in this episode.
One of us will actually be talking about health concerns. Someone who probably has not been outside yet today. I'm gonna guess. So yeah, get outside. Do drink, but drink in moderation. Dallas is on the East Coast, so it is a bit later in the day. It is way too early for me to drink. It's a little early for Dallas to drink, but not really. It's much more
judgy much.
Him. Judgy much. So look, for now, we're going to talk about, so we are here to talk about our very first comic book on this podcast. And this is kind of a big line in the sand for us because we came from all comics. We had a legacy show called the Wine and Comics Pairing Show, where we only paired wine with comics. We've been doing that for over a year. And when we started the podcast, I think we needed a break from comics, so we just were focusing on other things. We were also putting the legacy show to bed. So while we were recording our first episodes, we were still doing the final shows of the comic show. So all the comics were going into that show. They weren't here on the podcast, but here we are. We have arrived. Let the comics begin, along with the movies and the music. Our first TV show is coming up very, very soon. We're recording that in just another couple of days. And our first book, our first novel is coming up as well. So we are finally expanding beyond just movies and music, in case after 4 or 5, I think you're going to go, 5 episodes before you get your first something new kind of interjected in there. So look for all of the above. We aren't lying when we say that we pair wine with all of these things and not just movies and music. So first, of course, the announcements at the very top. We're going to talk about the comic in just a moment. But first, if you like what you hear, please make sure to follow us. Hit that follow or subscribe button. It helps the podcast grow. It helps us reach new listeners. We definitely want that because we love doing this and we want to keep doing it. And we would love to have, just to know, there's no number in my head. I don't know how many listeners it's going to take for me to feel like, hey, this is worthwhile. We're going to do it just because we love doing it. But you just want to know that someone's appreciating it. Someone's listening to it. You're not just doing it in a void. So that's always a very nice feeling. So if you love us, please leave that a review. Leave 5 stars because the algorithm does care whether it's 4.5 or 5. So that's 5. Right. Don't quibble. Don't get this. Well, I have to be true to myself, and it's not a perfect show. It's like, tip the wait staff. Don't wait for exceptional service. Just give them the goddamn tip. They're making sub minimum wage, so you need to give them that tip. We also make sub minimum wage. We make nothing. So give us a tip. Give us a 5-star review. And if you don't love us, if you're like, fuck this show, I hate this show, what is this show? All right, fine. But, send us a message.
That's right.
Send us a message. Wine, the letter N, pod, P-O-D for podcast, winenpod@gmail.com. Send us an email. We take all feedback seriously. That's right. And forget the review. no low-star reviews.
No low-star reviews.
Right. Unless you want us to disappear and you don't want other people listening to us. You're like, this show is so bad.
Don't tempt them with that. Come on, Dave.
It is bringing down the entire potosphere. We've got to get rid of this show. But if you're on your phone, you can also send us a text, quote unquote. You'll find a clickable link at the beginning of the description of this episode. It doesn't work as an active link on every platform, but it does on most. So if you see that on whatever platform you're consuming this on as a clickable link, just click that, which opens up your text app on your phone. I should say, I should have started this. If you're on your phone and you're listening to this, which most of us kind of are, then click that. It will open up your text app. Send us a direct message via that. It shows up on our Buzzsprout inbox. Does not show us your full phone number. Never fear. It only shows us your final 4 digits, kind of like how a credit card shows up on a receipt. It's just a right here, right now, quick and easy way. Send us a quick note, especially if it's a note of appreciation. We love that. But if it's a note of feedback, like guys, too much intro, hate your music, hate your choice in comics and music and movies, fine, send it to us. We want to hear. Or if you're like, well, when you talk about movies, when you talk about music, I would love to hear more about blank, or how you pair the wine with them. I would love to hear more about blank. If you have ideas, if you think this show could be better in some way, honestly, we are brand new. I would love to hear it. We
and
have
guys,
ideas of how. Yeah.
And guys, we are collectively and actively building a list. So if you have recommendations of things you might be interested in us covering, comic books, movies, albums, songs, just any sort of media or experience, we will consider it. We may not get to it, but we'll look at it. We might engage with you. And it might make you feel like you're part of this little corner of the world, this little crazy corner of the world that we are sort of building out and organically trying to grow. I hate the word organic. Don't hold it against me. I will probably say something rather rude and inappropriate about the terms like organic in the future. But in general, when you drop by and hit us up, leave us a 5-star review and maybe a recommendation.
There you go. And get Dallas. Do you still hate the word organic when it's in the context of wine?
Immensely. No. I love the word organic. No, of course not. I love the word organic when it comes to the context of wine because it's just such an open-ended kind of term. It allows for interpretation and opinion and conjecture, and that's the space where we live. So yeah,
it allows a bunch of talking heads to talk a lot,
ding.
And that's our bread and butter. And on Dallas's point, if you'd like to interact with us and feel like a part of this family, we are most active and most interactive with our fans on Substack. So wineand.substack.com. That is where we live. And if you become a paid member on Substack, you can get uncut versions of these episodes, which usually add anywhere from 10 to 30 additional minutes to the episode. And that is where, if you have suggestions, if you want to talk about, we're going to have polls in the future too, where you get to pick between a short list of things that we're going to cover next. So that is where to do it, is at our Substack. All right. And there will be a link down here in the description of this episode, so you can click that and head over to the Substack when you're ready. All right. So today, our very first comic book, one of the reasons it took us a little while to get to a comic book, not just that we were putting to bed our legacy show and we needed a break, and we were just very excited. And of course, I think our guests too, we kept reaching out to guests and they were like, I can talk about a movie. I can talk about an album. And it's like, okay, there are other things too, guys. There are other things too. But I also was kind of an asshole, and I picked for our first comic a very dense, a very chewy, a very this is not a comic you read overnight and then talk about the next day. This was something I was like, you know what? I want to revisit, Dallas. And I sent him a link and I was like, okay, when do you think we can get to it? I thought we'd get to it in like a week, even with everything else we had going on and the other things we were trying to review and prepare podcasts for. No. This is, we are here today to talk about The Adventures of Luther Arkwright by Bryan Talbot, considered to be the first British graphic novel. So this was a graphic novel that took 10 years of Bryan Talbot's life to create. And this is book 1, mind you. Not that he had planned that it was only book 1 at the time. At the time, this is a complete graphic novel. He came back with a sequel many years later. And one of the reasons I wanted to revisit this graphic novel, I'm going to start this because we always like to start with like, what's your history with these works and what are your memories of it? So the reason I wanted to do this, I read this back in high school days. This is a comic that It has a very staggered publishing history between the UK and the US. In the UK, not only did it take him 10 years to finish the thing, but it went through multiple publishers. He actually published this as 3 smaller graphic novels originally, because it was just taking him like years and years to make each smaller
Was that with Valkyrie?
slice. Yes.
Yeah.
And multiple. It wasn't just Valkyrie.
Right.
So actually, let's start here before I get into my own personal. So The Adventures of Luther Arkwright, very start and stop publication history. It started, now Bryan Talbot started doing short stories in some anthologies and whatnot.
Mere Myths.
This was during a time, in Bryan Talbot's own words, in a recent interview, he basically said that Britain was in a recession at the time. There was no work to be found anywhere. So he wasn't looking to become a comic artist. He didn't think that's what he wanted to do, but he couldn't find any work. And then a friend of his basically was like, well, hey, look, I'm starting up this publication, this anthology. Do you want, and you're an artist, do you want to contribute to it? And he had nothing better to do. Right. So he was like, okay, and contributed to this. At the time, Luther Arkwright is a comic that is heavily influenced by Michael Moorcock's Jerry Cornelius stories. And I don't know how much Michael Moorcock anyone has read. I have read pretty much all of Michael Moorcock. I'm not kidding. I've read all 15 series of The Eternal Champion.
Okay.
All right.
No.
Jerry Cornelius being one of them. So 2 things that Moorcock did here. On the one hand, Jerry Cornelius, he kind of came out and he made it free for any other author to use Jerry Cornelius. And he was like, anybody can write Jerry Cornelius stories. I want this to be a shared character, concept, and all these different iterations across the multiverse. I want people to be able to do this. Moorcock's Jerry Cornelius was very experimental compared to his other Eternal Champion books, which were much more streamlined, much more straightforward sci-fi fantasy. And Jerry Cornelius was kind of batshit. It was very psychedelic. It was very of its time. But at the same time, even to this day, I read Jerry Cornelius, and it's not it's like reading Burroughs, like Naked Lunch or something like that. Like there is something that's very literary in the way that it's playing with the literary form and doing things that are not perfectly straightforward, not perfectly linear or narrative. And they can be a tough read. They can be hard to be like, what am I reading? What is happening here? And you can see this in Luther Arkwright, at least initially. This was Talbot. He was coming off of reading Moorcock and being inspired by that. So when he started the Jerry Cornelius character, he freely admits, he's like, it was heavily inspired by that character. He was kind of doing his own version originally on that. Now, he did Luther Arkwright as short stories and anthologies first, and kind of really honed in on what this character was going to be before he started the series in earnest. So it already was more its own beast, but we are talking about parallel universes. We are talking about a figure that swings between these different parallels in ways that can be very confusing and ways that are very cool, are very what's the word, very modish, like Mod Squad, kind of a thing, like very of its time, but very cool, very, very counterculture, very it has these flavors of what was going on with the youth in Britain at the time, of which Talbot was one of them. And it really comes into its own as the series goes on, but it does very much start there. So with that said, Luther Arkwright was first published as short stories in a couple of different anthologies. And when he finally got serious, he published most of what became book 1, Rat Trap, of the Adventures of Luther Arkwright. So 1/3 of what the final Adventures of Luther Arkwright graphic novel would become. He did publish that in chapters throughout an anthology. And then between 78 and 80, it was a 5-part serial. Right. And then the story continued in a comics anthology called Psst, PSSST exclamation point, in 1982, which was a very big, like that anthology had a lot of the bigs that would become huge. Like I think that had stories by Grant Morrison. I want to say Garth Ennis. I could be wrong about that, but a lot of names that became huge in the British comic scene at the time. So this was like the beginning of what we now know as the British comic scene, sort of this weird golden period that from the late 70s into the 90s that America basically picked up, and like we basically carried them into Vertigo over at DC and gave them all careers over here because they were so electric and so amazing.
And actually,
Alan
Dave,
Moore,
to step back real quick here, the first appearance, guys, of Luther Arkwright, the character is in the Papal Affair. It
Papist.
is that's funny because it's Papist, but the version at the New York Public Library. There are two versions,
it says Papal.
and one is Papal and one is Papist. So
I think it, for longevity, like now when you look at the book, because I was able to download. Bryan Talbot actually has that short story as a free download on his website.
Yes.
So, and it's Papist. It's sort of like what it's become if it was ever Papal.
And
go ahead.
But I went to the Lions, the main branch of the New York Public Library, and checked out that original piece, and it is fantastic. It's black and white, and it's got these crazy nuns in it. It's kind of a kick-ass sort of launch for a character, guys. And curiously enough, I will say that the character, the sort of Luther Arkwright in that original piece, is much more interesting than the Luther Arkwright character in the broader piece. I will say that.
I'm going to disagree with that.
I'm going to say that. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that it's just sort of a very compressed kind of, that short piece is very compressed. So the character is a bit more dynamic, and in the broader piece, we'll get to it. But in the broader piece, Arkwright's fun, but go on.
See, I don't like the short piece.
I love it.
So there, I mean, it's a fun, like, ooh, yeah, this was raw, and also this was Talbot. Like, there is so much more interesting things he's doing in the final piece, in the final what became the Adventures of Luther Arkwright. But this first one feels a little almost Mad Magazine-y. Like, it's very... or like the comics you used to see in like things like Playboy or something like that, where it's like it's got this ludicrousness to it, very extreme, very violent, very sexy, but all the extremes in this and even his art style is mimicking this almost Mad Magazine-ish, like in a way that he dialed way down, and he evolved his style into something fairly different for what he finally did with Luther Arkwright, whereas here he's going for this romp of a comic.
Exactly. It's a romp. It is absolutely a romp.
It is, but not my thing. Not
my
thing. I was a little like, it's gratuitous. It's gratuitous all the ways, and was not my jam.
Oh, it's fantastic.
But it was very interesting to see that this was like, kind of his first. Everyone starts somewhere, and I feel like that was him mimicking what he thought. On the one hand, he was part of an era and a culture, and a generation that wanted comics to do more and do it in different ways. But of course, you still have to start somewhere. You're still, I don't know enough about late 60s to early 70s comics to know if this probably was maybe pushing some boundaries already, even though I look at it and I'm like, oh, come on, guy, you can do better than this. But for that era, that might have been a real border pusher. But it was that first one, all those chapters that were serialized were finally collected into The Adventures of Luther Arkwright, Book 1, Rat Trap. Nobody look up these titles. These are all long gone. No one needs to. These have all been collected into single volumes now. But originally, it was that Adventures of Luther Arkwright, Book 1, Rat Trap. Yeah. Then between 87 and 89, Talbot completed the story, which was published as a series of 9 standard comic books by Valkyrie, right? But Serge Boissevain, if I'm pronouncing his last name right, and I'm probably not, or Sergei Boissevain, paid for the printing of the Valkyrie Press trade paperback, The Adventures of Luther Arkwright, Book 2, Transfiguration, and then in 83, under the publisher name Prout, so he changed it. He finally published the final trade, Book 3, Götterdämmerung, or the that's Wagnerian. What does that always mean? The Twilight of the Gods, right?
Twilight of the Gods, I think. Yeah.
So very, very Wagnerian, and that is apropos. It's a very Wagnerian ending to the whole thing. It's hugely melodramatic, hugely big. I think what we should do is talk about this complete graphic novel in those 3 acts. nevertheless, because I feel like they are fairly distinct in how he grew as both an artist and a writer, especially, and how that he told the story. So, and then later in America, of course, Dark Horse Comics published the entire thing as 9 issues, and then collected them into trade format. I did not read them as single issues when I was young. So it was a trade paperback collection by Dark Horse. I'm almost positive. Okay. I remember reading this book. It had to have been my high school years. I'm shocked because reading it now in preparation for this podcast, I remember loving this book. I was blown away. I thought it was amazing. And reading it now, I'm like, I understood this fucking book in high school. How? I'm like, this is so complicated. And I'm patting my high school self on the back on this one, because I'm like, holy shit, high school Dave, good job. Because I feel like me now, I was struggling through the first act a little bit and trying to get into it.
Act 1 is definitely a lot of webbing. There's a lot of webbing happening.
And I've gotten soft, man. I'm like, I've kicked back and not challenged myself enough, because my brain must have been more adroit when I was, which most people's are when they're young. Let's face it.
Much more plastic. Much more plastic.
Yes. So I've calcified a bit, and I was like, damn, this is hard. And I remember, and I chose this book. The reason I suggested it to Dallas was my memory of how much I loved it, but how long it's been since I've revisited it. And I had even bought a used trade paperback, one of the more recent editions in black and white, that was on my shelf. And I saw it, and I was like, you know what? It's time. I need to reread this. I remember reading this. I did collect the sequel, Heart of Empire, in single issues when it was coming out. I was collecting at that time. I was old enough. It was a mature readers only comic, but I was able to get it at that point, and I would not have been old enough to have gotten the single issues when they were coming out. I'm not even sure if they must have been mature readers, but don't quote me on that. I'm not sure what Dark Horse did with that. And I know I was into, and I did not get the single issues, because when Dark Horse was publishing the single issues, I don't think I was into Dark Horse yet. That came later with like Frank Miller's Sin City, and Dark Horse had this Dark Horse Comics Greatest World, which was their own superhero line, which we'll have to cover their superhero line one of these days, Dallas, because man, that is another one idea. I have a memory of, and I'm like, that was something else. I feel, and there were some gems in there that are totally worth revisiting. But that came later. Right now, Dark Horse was predominantly licensed characters. They were doing the Aliens, the Predator, the Terminator, the RoboCop. They even had that Walter Simonson, Frank Miller, incredible Terminator versus RoboCop, or RoboCop versus Terminator. I forget which order it came in. But that series is still one of the best things I think comics has ever done in the world, like in history. It's an incredible series.
That's big.
It's big. It's big. And no licensed or weird, the something versus something. Yeah. There were 2 series that did it so impeccably well. The very first Aliens versus Predator, there's a reason that has become such a cultural, like it's stuck to the culture, is because first series was nuts good.
That's true.
And then this RoboCop versus Terminator, which is, if memory serves, they did the story where the technology of RoboCop becomes a thing that like Skynet is after, or it was part of what becomes Skynet in that world, in RoboCop's world, something like that. But they tethered it together really brilliantly well. And then the story and the action in it is just God level. It's like you could not make a better crossover than that. It is not paint by numbers. No one was dialing this shit in.
All right, that goes to the top of our crossover special edition mini arc.
There you go. There you go. All right, but getting back to Luther Arkwright. So I read this in high school. I remembered loving it. I really wanted to revisit it, and especially because we should mention the 3rd book is actually landing. I believe it's been released in Britain already, but it has not been released in America yet. I pre-ordered it. It is dropping soon.
Also, you can go to the New York Public Library and view
it's already there.
A lovely gilded printing of it. Fantastic.
Yes. It has already been released in Britain, so it's obviously already finished.
Yeah.
And apparently Dallas, he's on the East Coast. He found that. I have to wait for my copy to come in, but we hope to cover this, In a later episode, we will cover the sequel, Heart of Empire, and in time for the American release of the third, which, by the way, this is The Adventures of Luther Arkwright. The second, Heart of Empire, is AKA The Legacy of Luther Arkwright. And then the third book is The Legend of Luther Arkwright. So we're going to hit all three in order and as time. But today, it's The Adventures of Luther Arkwright. Dallas, had you even heard of this book before I threw it at you?
I had. So here's what's crazy. When we started the agency way back in the, I don't even know what year it was. I forgot.
I don't either.
Jesus Christ. Like, we're going to say 2009. We'll go with that.
Nine,
something like that. I had my own list of things that, I'd been collecting, sort of the sort of seminal works that I need to kind of wade through that I hadn't by that point. And this was on the list, and I had a copy of it. Started reading it, got through the first third, and it was sort of like, he's just, this guy's laying groundwork. I don't know if I'm going to stick around for the rest of this. I'll come back to it in the future. And I never got around to it. So this was one of those occasions when I was like, that's right. I remember this. So yeah, it's, but you're right. Everyone I'd ever really known who had a sort of an academic sort of approach to comic books or graphic novels, they understood where it fit in the lineage, how important it was in terms of European and British comics and graphic novels, and just how it just was sort of the benchmark for a lot of the guys who came afterwards. And also, the idea of the multiverse cannot be understated, because what they're doing in this sucker, anyone who's ever tried to weave a large story and dole it out in chapters, you should probably take a look at this, because it is a roadmap of how to eventually land the plane.
Stick the landing.
Eventually he sticks the landing. But that first third, man, it is all over the runway.
It is. Let's talk about that. So first third, which was initially published. So this is roughly the first three issues as they were published as single full-sized issues. And the graphic novel or the act is called Book One, Rat Trap. This is the introduction of Luther Arkwright as a multiverse hopping. So universe to universe. They call it parallel universes. So let's just call it a parallel universe hopping. What do we even call him? He's sort of a jack of all trades, devil may care, adventurer.
It's a mercenary adventurer, kind of. Yeah.
It's so one of the things that makes
He's a journeyman. He's a journeyman.
Yeah. Okay. Journeyman. But he is also, so this is something that the character shares with Michael Moorcock's Jerry Cornelius a little bit, is that each iteration, or from the way in which the character is presented, they're not a specific something. They're a somebody, but they're not a specific something. And that gets you as the reader get a little lost with your bearings with them. They made Jerry Cornelius movie adaptations where they just straight up made him a secret agent. Like, very, very Austin Powers-y-esque, where it's sort of like it's from that time period, very, like I said, Mod Squad-ish kind of a thing. You're hip, you're cool, you're young, you get the soundtrack of all like what the kids were listening to at the time, and then you dress well, you got a gun, and you do daring deeds and go on adventures and try and stop sort of nefarious things from happening. And Michael Moorcock hates the movies. He looks at the movies and he's on record as saying, like, Jerry Cornelius was never a secret agent or a super spy or anything like that. That was never anything he was, never anything that he did. And Luther Arkwright in this first act suffers the same issue, though, where you have a really hard time calling him anything else. And so you're just sort of like, but if he's not, but he's kind of not, but he kind of is, but he's kind of not, but he kind of is.
What he really is doing, he's of course playing God, and he's walking through your imagination and just dropping little sort of vignettes and images and important sort of set pieces that will become important in the future, giving you sort of, not even context, giving you sort of visuals into parallel universes, into sort of what's happening, what happened in the past, And these things kind of seem isolated and disjointed. And a lot of them kind of are. But as I said, that's why I use the term webbing. It's sort of like when a spider builds a web. If you watch it, it moves at a glacial space, and there's no real context or, skeletal structure that you can recognize. And that's what's happening in this first third. And it is
act. Yeah.
It is just not an uphill battle, but you do have to remind yourself, oh, okay, I'm climbing a mountain here. I'm just climbing the mountain here. And as long as you tuck in for that, it'll pay off eventually. But you're right. He does kind of just it feels like he's kind of just trundling through and dropping these boulders and sort of images. And, you're just like, okay, bro, where are we going? Where are we going here? Where are we going?
Right. And I don't think, Dallas, have you ever read Grant Morrison's The Invisibles?
Another one I started and never finished. Yeah.
Okay.
I could say that without too much judgment.
A lot of people nowadays have not read The Invisibles. They know of it. They know it's a cornerstone of Grant Morrison's oeuvre, however you say that word. So I collected Invisibles issue by issue from beginning to bitter end back in the day. It was well after I'd read Luther Arkwright. So I never connected the two, but looking back, and Luther Arkwright predates the Invisibles entirely from, it was well over before issue 1 of Invisibles ever saw the light of day.
Yeah.
It was shocking to me how much this was a blueprint for Grant Morrison. It feels. Especially this opening. Now, Morris, and even the way in which it goes from The Invisibles suffered a little bit of the same thing, where in fact, I have a quote I'm going to give about The Invisibles and how it connects, or how readers might connect it to Luther Arkwright. I'm going to go look up that article. I didn't have it ready. I'm going to go look that up while you're talking about something, Dallas. So since I'm talking right now, I won't do it quite yet. But I will say it still struck me how much this did it first. And Invisibles, not only is Luther Arkwright about these mysterious groups of intelligent beings, usually called something. In Luther Arkwright, they're called the Disruptors.
The Disruptors.
And they are above, the Earth.
Yes.
They are not of the one universe, and they're
all in the fabric we don't see. Yeah.
Right. And they are manipulating everything. And we are fighting against that manipulation.
Yeah.
And even the way in which Talbot, in this first act, tries to lay that groundwork and show you how we're working against them, but how they're working against us, and how we have our own secret organizations like the Invisibles, where, we're trying to fight back in these ways. That even the way the Invisibles showed it, because the Invisibles did this fun thing, like Jerry Cornelius, like Luther Arkwright, that sometimes it's very straightforward, and sometimes it's like, now we're super spies in this very retro way. Now we're in super
it's like whatever the moment calls for.
Yeah, right. We can do it. And Luther Arkwright, in only 9 issues, did what the Invisibles took was something like 60-ish issues to do, or 50-ish issues to do. And Luther Arkwright does it in just 9, and it's everything the Invisibles did for the most part. And I'm impressed as all fuck. And this one would be my preferred. Invisibles is something I'm so glad I read it. I read it once. Maybe for this podcast, we will revisit that whole.
That's actually a good idea. I should. Yeah, that's a good idea. We'll do a little.
We will try, but at the same time, Luther Arkwright is very much the far more focused, far more compressed, and at the same time, I feel like Talbot in this first act, he's trying to do what Morrison stuck to his guns doing throughout the Invisibles in its entirety. And I think Talbot, after this first act, was like, okay, I'm finding my sea legs as a writer. I think there's a better way to do this. And he does do it. I think from a reader perspective, he does it better in Acts 2 and 3. and brings, and as Dallas said, he brings it home. He sticks the landing in a way that Morrison does not in that Invisibles series. I know a lot of people will say, bullshit, Morrison totally stuck the landing. You gotta read between. And I'm like, look, I know it makes quote unquote sense. I know there is a book out there that is a guide to the Invisibles series that is panel by panel throughout the entire series.
Not the entire series.
And I'm like, and it's not written by Morrison. It's someone else who went panel by panel through the series and gives you an entire reading guide to it.
All right, we may have to find that person for a future episode.
And let me tell you something. I think that book is probably necessary to fully understand the Invisibles. It probably is. I owned it at one point. I think I sold it at one, and I read about half of it. And I was like, you know what? Everything this guy's writing about makes sense. He really is breaking all this stuff down. But it is, I think you need a book like that to fully understand and appreciate everything in the Invincibles. And if you do, did Morrison succeed as a storyteller? If you have to be in his head and be as in control of the story as he is as a writer.
Was it successful? Yeah.
Right. As a writer, did you truly do your job if someone requires a panel by panel Cliff Note guide to get what you fucking did? Right?
Hot take. Don't make sure you guys, when you call in and write in with your complaints and gripes and yells and curse words, make sure you put Dave as the recipient of that one.
My take on Act 1 is it's very tantalizing. It's very it's interesting. It's new. It's doing a lot in a very short amount of space, but to the point where it is almost opaque. One thing that it did free him up to do, though, and I will say this is the one kudo I give beyond just how interesting that first act is and how daring and groundbreaking it was, because it was all of those things for that time. But the kudo I can give him for any time is that we keep saying how dense it is, and it is so dense. It lays so much groundwork. It really does free him in the next two acts.
Absolutely.
To just go, run. You don't really need to lay any more groundwork. No. It's you don't realize how much has been laid until you get to those acts and you realize how quickly he just bam. It just advances. That plot starts ramping up, and you're like, "Holy shit! It is not slowing down."
And it makes sense because he's done. Yeah. He's laid all the groundwork.
He's done all the work.
It's pure action. It's pure knocking into the next point. For those second, at least definitely for the third act, but for Act 2 as well. It's just sort of that potential energy turning into that kinetic energy. And those last two acts they're all kinetic. They're going.
Yes. Yes. So. Yeah. Act 2, let's talk about that. Act 2, Transfiguration. This is, as much as we say Act 2 and 3, because there is an evolution. And I will say Act 2 is kind of a halfway point between Act 1 and Act 3. Like how clear and chugging forward Act 3 is. Because Act 3 is all climax. It is crazy climax. Whereas Act 2, there still is some, we need to lay... as much as I just said you don't need to lay anymore, there's at least some repeating of some of the things he laid in Act 1 more clearly than he did in Act 1, so that you grasp what's going on a little bit better, so that by the time he gets to Act 3, I think you're so on board and so like, I get the stakes. And that's something that was missing a little bit from Act 1. It's so nebulous. The threats are so ephemeral and so high, big, and the ideas are so big and amorphous that you almost don't quite grasp what's like. So
yeah. It's all concept. Yeah, Act 1 is all concept.
Right. The universe is at stake, but what
does that mean?
Really?
Right.
And Act 2 starts to pull it back a little bit and be like, okay, this is, at least for the players here, let's just focus on a few worlds, a few of our big players, focus a little more on who Luther is and what he's trying to accomplish here so that you understand that as well. And then let's boil this down so that the stakes are a bit more focused, a bit more brought down to earth. And Act 3 kind of takes those stakes back up a notch, where it's like, okay, we fooled you into thinking it was very earthbound, but now let's look at the earthbound and the high-end ephemeral universal and multiversal even, and let's tether them together because that's what's happening here. um, which I think he does brilliantly. But Act 2, you're meeting more of the supporting cast as well, in ways where they're not. In Act 1, all supporting characters are almost weirdly transitory. They're there, they're gone. They have a name, he draws them, and you're like, who was that?
Yeah.
I don't understand. Like,
I guess I'll see that guy later, maybe. Yeah.
Right. Who are any of these people? It's too ephemeral. It's too big. True. And then here in Act 2, you really start to meet the supporting cast as real supporting cast. And you start to get a sense of real drama, real narrative through line. Like, this is where it all starts to sing. And as the reader, you become locked into the narrative. You really want to see what happens next now, not just out of an intellectual exercise. You're not just curious as to where this weird comic guy who came out of fucking nowhere and is doing things you've never seen before, what he does with this. Because yes, you're intrigued by that. But here, the narrative actually captures you.
I will say, that character, just some background on some of the characters, guys. There's, of course, Luther Arkwright, who, he's got this sort of transformation coming. Won't give away too much. He is sort of part James Bond, part, he's a womanizer in his own way. He's got a woman in every port. That
works.
Yeah, he's got a woman in every port. He becomes a sort of messianic kind of character, and we start to see that taking shape in Act 2. You've got Rose, and Rose, am I saying? Yeah, Rose. She's able to kind of be a tether into all these different worlds for him without giving too much away. Cromwell will sort of see develop. Now, I will say, in terms of the art, what he does with this Cromwell character, we're in Act 2 now, right? Yeah. So we've seen Cromwell.
We technically see him.
We've seen them all, right?
We don't know who they are.
Right, we've seen them all. But what he does, I think it's on page like 105 or 107. But he does this thing where this Cromwell character, you can see his sort of syphilitic sores on his mouth because, part of this is set in this sort of Cromwellian Britain kind of parallel, alternate universe. Alternate histories. We don't like to use the term, I guess, alternate histories. But this Cromwell thing, there's a great page where you see the sores on his fucking mouth and his face. It just, some of the characters are just kind of fantastic. I love Cromwell. I love Rose. Like I was telling Dave earlier, I think Luther for me is kind of one of the least interesting characters.
Yes. Well, I know, because you said you liked the short story better, and I kind of understand that, but I kind of disagree, only because I feel like Luther is, yes, he's a cipher. He's meant to be up to a point. But I feel like he finds his own humanity in this story. Like, that's his arc,
that's his journey,
is finding his place with the rest of the world and like who he is and what he is. Because he is the one thing up front about Luther Arkwright, so this is not a spoiler in any way, is he is he can traverse the parallel worlds at will, which no one else can do. And the reason, or the ostensibly the reason, what you're told at the beginning, is because he is a unique, one of a kind person. So he doesn't have any other versions of himself in these other parallel worlds. We don't know why. We don't know what makes him special in these two ways. He just is special in those two ways.
Yeah. And good on good on Bryan for just establishing a character as special and then not really giving any context for that specialness until like Act 3, really. So that's fantastic.
Right. And he does, Luther changes, like, this is why I can see Talbot as a creator just evolve with his character, where at first he's trying to do things with the medium, and so he's not really focusing on character, right? I think it gets a little lost in that Act 1.
Even the art style is so hyper realistic to me. I think of it as hyper realism, and there are some pages that actually look computer generated, that they're so sharp. The line work is so specific. that I had a
Yeah.
difficult time believing this book written in, 79 or 80 wasn't done on a fucking MacBook in 2006. Like there was a moment I was like, wow, okay, he's
Right.
really good at this. Yeah.
Yes. And I think giving Luther more of a character, and then even his powers like evolve over time, like how much he wants Luther to do and how he wants Luther to do it. You can just see Talbot finding himself and this character and this story.
Yeah.
Like I'm sure he had like an outline for it and whatnot, or just like copious notes, some notebooks and notebooks filled with like ideas, and sketchbooks, of course, like filled with like all these characters and ideas.
Right.
But as he goes, he really cements himself as he's a rare artist that is at this level of artistry that has also become like one of the great like narrative storytellers, like writers. And I think there are only a handful out there that can claim the same thing, Walter Simonson being one of them, where his art style
Good
is
company.
something that everyone can just like worship at the altar.
It's a reference for just
and
about everyone. Yeah.
Right. And he can write and not even be the artist on something, like Talbot can do as well. And like it's an amazing story. Like he became a great writer on top of being a great artist. And there aren't that many that have pulled that off. And Talbot is definitely one of them. By the end of the series, he has become a great writer.
Oh yeah.
The end of this series, the final act of this series is just a masterclass in how you climax an epic storyline.
I'm telling you, he brings it home, man. He lands this fucking flight, which initially was going off
on
the
every
runway,
level, with
just
every
lands it,
character,
man.
with every concept. I mean, you're just like, how, dude? That was amazing.
There's so yes, to your point, he definitely evolves, and I want to believe that this was an organic evolution, but then there's a part of me that thinks this comes together so seamlessly that it feels like he had every note planned out from the beginning. So I am, while that sort of artist, in me wants to believe, yes, there was an evolution here and it was organic. He evolved with the story, with the character, and changed and replotted as he went. But there's also a part of me that's just like, what if this guy had this planned out like this from the beginning? Because it just comes together so seamlessly. So yeah, maybe I'll ask him one day if I meet him. Is he still around?
And by the way, I looked up that article about the Invisibles and Luther Arkwright.
Yeah.
So I did want to read this one little quote. I think this is the quote right here. So this is to give credit where it's due. I found this online. This is a guy, just Arthur. That's all I know. That's what he signs off on. But fakegeekboy.wordpress.com. And even though it's wordpress.com, this is only from 2021, so not too old. So this is
damn Arthur.
From February 15th, 2021. Puritans, Purges, and Parallel Worlds. Maybe. So I did want to read Bryan Talbot's The Adventures of Luther Arkwright began in 1978 in the pages of the short-lived Near Myths, a short-lived attempt at a more adult sort of British sci-fi comic, which was also the home to some early work by Grant Morrison. Morrison's own later The Invisibles and The Filth would later take a certain amount of inspiration from Luther Arkwright with their mashup of high technology, occultism ranging from earthy hedge magic to erudite mysticism as a lens for interpreting psionic capabilities and metaphysical truths, sexy espionage shenanigans, and countercultural fashionability.
Yeah, that about covers it. That about covers it.
Yes.
About covers
I'm like, and that's the thing. So much of the flavors and the aesthetics of Luther Arkwright, and even what they're doing with those, is exactly what the Invisibles did later. And I'm like, reading this now, having read the Invisibles since, it was a little eye-opening. I was like, damn, Grant, that is. And apparently too, like Talbot is very on record how much he was inspired by Jerry Cornelius. And he's like, look, initially he was a Jerry Cornelius ripoff, almost like I wanted to do my version, which Moorcock was even allowed. He's like, yeah, everyone do their version of Jerry Cornelius. A lot of people don't know that one of the artist Mabius, or Mobius, depending on how you like to pronounce it, the French artist, his Airtight Garage, which is considered his masterpiece, is a Jerry Cornelius story. It was him doing a Jerry Cornelius story, which he later took the name Jerry Cornelius out of the graphic novel, thinking that Michael Moorcock didn't like the story. So later editions didn't have it. Apparently that was a miscommunication.
Interesting.
Moorcock simply read it and he's like, I love the story. He was kind of like, it's not really a Jerry. I think in passing, he told to like a third party, like, I love the story. It's not a Jerry Cornelius story though.
And Mobius was like, oh God, no.
I was like, he hates it, and took it out.
I've offended
and then later,
the dog.
Moorcock was like, no, you can use it. I don't think it's a Jerry Cornelius story, but it's yours. So you do what you want with it. But apparently Moorcock has always been a little more dismissive of Morrison and Invisibles and things like that, because I think Morrison has never fully admitted the Jerry Cornelius connection to the Invisibles, which, motherfucker, there's so much Jerry Cornelius in the Invisibles, it's not even funny. Whereas Talbot has always been very open about that. And he and Moorcock are very close to this day, whereas I think Moorcock and Morrison are not. This, if you love Morrison, if you love Invisibles, if you love his Batman stuff, read this first Luther Arkwright. Because it is so much of what Morrison later introduced to the wider world of comics readers. And I don't think enough people have ever deep dived.
Yes, dived deeply. We'll go with that.
Dived deeply into Luther Arkwright.
Deeply, I don't know.
So I don't think enough people have taken that plunge into Luther Arkwright, and you should, because it is so much of a precursor and honestly, in some ways, like a shocking map of what Morrison later became, while sticking the landing, as me and Dallas have both agreed on, sticking the landing in ways that a lot of Morrison's long form work doesn't do or doesn't bother to do. Like, I do think he doesn't bother to do it. I think that's a choice.
Maybe that's it. Maybe actually I didn't consider that. Maybe it's just a conscious choice to not land in that sort of succinct way.
Of course it is. I just don't like it, so I'm not gonna give it a high score. I'm like, it's a choice, but it's personally for me too. I think from a theoretical standpoint, it's a lazy choice because it's hard to do something groundbreaking and experimental and interesting and thematically interesting and on point and stick the landing narratively
and satisfy your reader. That's true.
That is the complete package. And the complete package will always just be on a higher level on that hierarchy than not the complete package. Even if, we don't want not everything should be the complete package either, because that could become formulaic in its way, and you don't want that either if everything is that. But when someone comes out the gate, does something wildly different, and sticks that, like, and they are the complete package, I got to give them kudos for that. I got to give them that higher rung on the ladder because of that. So what are we pairing with this?
Actually, hold on one second. Let's see. Make sure I got through all the notes. Hold on here. By the way, guys, after reading this, and I read through this twice, which is one of the reasons our recording was held up, but I also came across a radio drama of this.
It's on Spotify.
It's actually on Spotify and Audible. Starring David Tennant, which is the 10th Doctor,
as Luther Arkwright.
As Arkwright. And it is actually a great little companion to this. I will say it's a lot of fun as a sort of secondary material here. Did I get through all the notes? Did we get through all the notes? Yeah. By the way, Princess Diana and the royal family do make appearances in this little piece here. So if you enjoy a little 20th century pop culture, a few references, you will see some of that. You get Cromwell's Britain, which is sort of turned on its ear. It's kind of fun. You get, and curiously enough, Cromwell, the character, is weirdly Trumparian, I will say. Trumpian or Trumparian. I like Trumparian. So if that is something you'd like to see kind of personified and exaggerated, I recommend this book. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. Also, you get some tantric sex. There's a great character called Harry Fairfax. Anyway, all right.
All the good stuff. All the good stuff.
Yes. So pairings.
right.
You go first, Dave. I went first last time. I'm curious.
You did.
How did you?
Even though this will be coming out in reverse order, so you didn't go first last time.
Yeah.
But you did.
Oh,
You
that's
did
true.
the one
You're
we
right. It will
recorded
come up.
yesterday.
That's right. We just recorded yesterday.
The one we recorded yesterday, he did go first, so I'll go first this time. But this one's actually, I think this one's going to drop next week.
Oh yeah,
because
probably.
I want something in between the albums, so it's like bam, right away.
That's right. Yeah.
But anyway, so a couple ideas I had with this one. I did think I tried a couple of things too. This is so dense of a read. Even when you get to the climax, even when it's like go, 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 you are sometimes looking at like 15 panels on a page.
Oh yeah.
It's so much is happening, but I mean, your eyes. There's very little text sometimes, so you're just like go, 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 like panel, 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 and it's all like building up and just like. So you feel like this chugging. I mean, the book just erupts in the final third, but at the same time, never stops being dense visually. Never stops. I mean, that art is absolutely incredible.
Can't recommend the art enough, guys. Go. It's kind of unreal for its time and for what he did and for how dense it is, the output alone. But go on.
Yes. It's incredible. And then, of course, the writing, especially when you're starting on this, there's so much to take in, so much to read. I highly suggest, if you're young, get it in print, fine.
Definitely.
If you're old, get it in digital so you can pinch zoom.
Oh,
because there's so much text.
By the way, Dave, sorry, a note I wanted to say. So the original run of this didn't come in our American sort of specs. It was sort of the size of actual periodical magazines and vinyl records. So, which, one of the things about reading it is that the text can be a little difficult to see in these secondary runs and printings because the original was so large.
When I was in high school, I read the American version, had no problem. So I know when you're young, it's not a problem. Me, I pulled the physical copy of the American version off my shelf, got to like page 3 and was like, nope. I was like, not happening. Put it down, downloaded it, and opened it up on my phone and pinch zoomed through the whole fucking thing.
Oh, time is a bitch.
Yep. And I need to go see an eye doctor someday just to get some reading glasses. I think it's finally time. I don't need it in like life. Like when I'm looking at my computer, I'm fine. But for little tiny text, like I'm like, it's time. It's time now because it looks like a little tiny text now.
It does.
Shit. It's time. But yeah, it's dense. And when he crams text onto these pages, he crams images onto these pages. So I thought I knew I wanted I had to stick to reds.
Ooh,
I could not. I thought of something light and airy, and it could work, but perfect match for me, no. It needed something that had layers and density like this book. I wanted to match that. Now, on the other hand, recently we did something. Oh yeah, I think it was the first album we did for Cannes. When I went with a Grunerveldt Leaner to keep it lean and linear and simple in its way, to not distract me from how dense the music was and how weird the music was in its way. So I can see someone needing that. For me, I decided the way in which I needed that was I needed something I only wanted to sip once in a while.
Okay.
So you take a sip, you put it down, and you're not looking back up at that glass for at least 10 more pages, and you just don't need anything else. So I went with a dessert wine on this. And I did. Now, one thing that did almost work, I tried a red. I tried your basic Côte de Rhone GSM style blend. I actually first got this. I have this, and I want to shout this out because it's a really great budget wine. But I got this La Vielle Ferme French. This is it breaks the rules of the Rhone a little bit because it's not Grenache heavy. It does have, it's Grenache Syrah, but it's led by Cinsault and Carignan. Are the two predominant grapes, and you're not allowed to call it a Rhone if Grenache is not at least 40%.
40%.
So this does not have enough Grenache in it to be that. So they had to just, it's just a product of France, red wine, kind of a thing. But $8.99 at Whole Foods right now.
Nice.
Okay. And it's part of the Famille Perrin group of wines. So the guys who do that, the Côte de Rhone, they are currently have a $7.99 proper Côte de Rhone at Trader Joe's that they're selling that is very good, very delicious, totally worth $7.99. This is totally worth $8.99. This was a little lighter on its feet because it's got that Carignan Cinsault and less Grenache. It's not as dark and brooding as a Rhone or like a Chateauneuf de Pape would be. This winds up being a bit more ruby, a bit redder, a bit more ruby, bit more transparent, lighter in body, but really delicious, wonderful herbaceous and red fruit flavors in there. So this was almost gentle enough and yet layered in its flavors that I was like, this is pleasant, but it's not a perfect match. It still wasn't quite matching what I was looking for. So when I thought of a dessert wine, I thought of a port.
Okay.
I thought of something like a Sauterne. I thought of just like a late harvest white or a late harvest red and what that would do. And I sent you a photo of this last night, Dallas, that I had a bottle of Banyuls.
Oh, yeah.
That I had never opened.
Yeah.
And I'd never tried a Banyuls before. They're not the easiest thing to find in the wild to go into a store. I think if you go to a wine shop, like proper wine shop, they might have a Banyuls. Banyuls is a wine. It's port. It's like a ruby port. Is probably the thing that you can compare it closest to. It is made out of Grenache. It's Grenache heavy, or made entirely out of Grenache. And it's made in a southern part of France. The Banyuls territory is, let's see, I believe Banyuls is the southeastern corner of Roussillon. Which is not a region I'm particularly familiar with either. But Banyuls is one of those I always heard about. And it is, it's kind of ruby port. It's red. It's redder. I thought it would be browner. And when I opened it, maybe it's just because of that Banyuls name with the B in it. And I'm like, oh, it's going to be like brown. Banyuls, brown. And something about the sound of that word. I'm like, this is going to be like a tawny port or like a rich, oxidized kind of sherry wine, like sweet sherry or something. No, it's red. It's nice and bright red. It's got acidity to it, which was surprising. More acidity than a port. It is fortified like a port, so it's got that higher alcohol, but a little less than a port. So it's like 16% is your average for a Banyuls, whereas port is usually around 20 in terms of alcohol. And it is surprisingly fruity. It's nice while having, like it is fortified. So the first sip I took, I was like, woo! That's got a kick. That's nice. But it's sweet. Probably around, I think the average for Banyuls is 8% residual sugar. So you're usually looking at around like 6 to 8% is what you're going to get. Which is sweet, but not like cloyingly sweet. It's just nicely sweet. And there's something about sipping this. I was reading the climax while I was sipping this last night. And you take a sip and you're just like, ooh, it's rich, but not too rich. It's decadent. It's layered. It has some complex flavors are going on in there. It's got an earthiness to it, even though it's not brown. There is this little bit of garrigue, right? What they call that thing. Like you've got this sort of like slightly herbaceousness, almost to a point of minty menthol quality to it. Definitely lots of dark chocolate in there, along with like this sort of stewed, like Grenache is really going to give you these strawberry flavors. So like these stewed strawberry or cherry flavors. And then this acidity that keeps it weirdly light, even though you've got that sweetness in there. And every sip is such a nice, full, round sip that you'd sip it, you'd put it down, and you would go like at least 5-10 pages. And then you're like, oh yeah, I could use another sip. And that keeps you in the book and what you're reading. It's matching that density. The sweetness takes a little bit of that heaviness away, even where you're just sort of like, I think this book is heavy themed. It's dark. There's a lot of death. There's a lot of destruction. there is whatever triumph there is at the end is it's wartime victory. It's a victory, but there's a lot of no one's happy they had to go through what they went through to get there, right?
Point, yeah.
It's not just victory, we won.
No.
You know, it's like there's a lot of sadness, there's a lot of tragedy, there's triumph, but tons of tragedy. I found the sweetness was something that kept me, and that it kept me elevated, kept me in the right pleasant mindset with the wine, while being something I only needed a sip now and again. So dessert wine, if you can't find a Banyuls, go for a Ruby Port. I think that's also something that's fruity, sweet, has a nice kick of alcohol. You only need to sip it once in a while. That's my pairing. I'd go dessert wine all the way. I thought the Banyuls is a slightly more complex than your standard Ruby Port, so I would go with that to match the complexity of the comic. But otherwise, yeah, dessert wine all the way.
All right.
What you got?
Curiously enough, I sort of ventured toward those. I veered toward those dessert wines as well. I thought a port, maybe even a white port.
Yeah.
You know, something that had a sweetness that kind of countered the kind of darkness and grimness of this really unsettling kind of world that was really sort of acrid and acidic. But then I decided I needed something with the complexity of a red, you know, just because the book is so sort of dynamic. I then thought I couldn't imagine drinking a red for this ride. I just couldn't imagine drinking a red for this ride because it's already so dark, and even the world is sort of clawing. You know, not to use a wide term, but the world is sort of clawing. And so I started thinking, well, what's sort of the halfway point between those two, maybe? And it's like, okay, what about the white world? What about the white grapes? And white, definitely not. But then I veered into the orange realm, right? I was like, okay, maybe there's a space here that is that has the depth of a red, but also has the buoyancy of a dessert wine. And so I started thinking a sparkling orange wine. And I came to a sparkling orange wine. It's the Spergola grape, which is a white wine variety from northern Italy. Not very well known. It it's been displaced by the Pinot Grigios, Chardonnays, and Sauv Blancs, but in this particular treatment, it kind of shines because the fermentation process is, of course, direct press. It's done in steel tanks. There's temperature control, and that kind of echoes what Talbot's done with his piece here. It is kind of temperature controlled because he's kind of controlling, even though it seems like chaos, he's controlling every page. He really is. Every piece he drops has a reason for being there. There's malolactic fermentation here. It is, again, the Spergola grape and the Malvasia aromatico. It is an Italian. It's aged in a clay and silt. It is kind of, it's juicy, right? It's very juicy, very aromatic. It flexes. So, the first glass is one thing. The second glass feels completely different. Glass 3 feels completely different. And I got the...
Interesting. That's what you... Flexes. So what do you mean by flexes when you say that it changes?
Yeah. So, when there's certain wines, certain grapes that when you eat them with food, depending on the acidity level of the food or whatever it is, it sort of changes fully on the palate. Like,
I'm just thinking flexes like with a person, you're like, they flex and it's like, so it's strong. Like, they're when you flex, whether you're strong or not, you're like trying to come across as strong. I thought it was like I think impact or something.
A slightly different connotation.
I've just never heard the word
flexing, meaning changes. Sort of, it flexes, it shifts, it changes, rather than sort of.
I've just never heard flexing used in that connotation. So that threw me.
Well, there you go.
Okay.
Add it to your list of new context. So we've got the it's from Denny Benny is the vineyard here. It is their Busa Bianco dell'Emilia. It is, as you've seen, this is the second bottle I've gone through. I really like it. And again, I'm an orange guy who, when it comes to orange wines, I enjoy a glass. But after that, I'm going to need something else to kind of complement it, change it. This actually just opens up on its own. And again, this is a sparkling orange Italian, which is sort of anchored by the Spergola grape. In terms of price point, you're looking at probably $25 at your better sort of wine stores, and 11% alcohol. If that's a consideration for you, but
low. It would. I thought you needed low alcohol. For me, I went with the high alcohol dessert wine, but you sip it very slowly, right? So it hits you very slowly because you got to keep your wits about you on this graphic novel.
There you go.
You can't. The moment you start to lose it a little bit, even just into tipsy,
Right.
You ain't following shit on that page.
Right.
So you need to keep your wits a fair bit about you on this. So yeah, do something that you sip slow or has, like Dallas did, low alcohol to begin with.
Yeah.
Fluctuate might have been
no, flex
is what you mean by flex, but yeah.
No,
I never heard that word used.
It's okay.
All right.
Flex. You got a new word, new context.
I suppose. I don't know if I'll ever use it that way. I gotta look up the Urban Dictionary and see if we've actually been using it that way, or if this is like your own creation, which I'm cool with, but I feel like it's your own creation.
Connotation and denotation. You got denotations, you got primary connotations and secondary connotations and tertiary connotations.
Yeah,
and, there you go.
Yeah.
This is one of those cases.
But if you're the only one poetically using it in this way, I'm like, I get
That's
it.
What I do.
Flex, like, yeah. Okay.
Sweet. Good episode.
All right, folks.
Good episode.
That is Luther Arkwright, The Adventures of Luther Arkwright, which is the actual full book 1. Book 2, Heart of Empire, a.k.a. The Legacy of Luther Arkwright, we will hit in a future episode, all in preparation of that third book, The Legacy of Luther Arkwright, which is up for pre-order on Amazon or elsewhere. I know there are some bookstores, Shakespeare & Co., Barnes & Noble, things like that you can all pre-order from as well, and your local comic shop, of course. You can go pre-order it from there. It has been listed in Diamond. I ordered it from Golden Apple Comics here in LA. So go, if you have never read any Luther Arkwright, you absolutely have to. You cannot call yourself a comics fan.
And check out the audiobook.
Certainly not. Yeah, and check out the audiobook. The audiobook is on Spotify. I've already followed it. I haven't tried it yet, but the cast is kind of stunning. Apparently, David Tennant recorded this right before he got cast in Doctor Who. So it was like he did this and then became like a mega star immediately after. But they got him for this right before that happened. So, but he's at his peak even then because he's damn good.
He's great.
So yeah, take a listen, but read the comic first if you can. I feel like the audiobook will probably come across better.
Yeah, read the book first for sure.
Yeah. All right, guys, this was our first comic. We'll be back for another one soon, I am sure. We will definitely do something different before we do the second book of Luther Arkwright, so keep our eye out for that. But once again, this has been Wine, and I am Dave Baxter. With me has been my co-host,
I'm Dallas.
And we will be back next week for another wine and entertainment pairing for your entertainment. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Ciao.